So welcome everybody. In the next 45 minutes, we will have the pleasure and the chance to speak about multi-generational fairness. My name is Joanna Lenkova. I'm a futurology director at the LEGO Group, and it's my absolute pleasure to be able to facilitate this discussion with Catarina Tully. Kat has an amazing experience in working across multiple different sectors. So she's worked for government, for civil society, for business as well, and she's been helping them to prepare for the future. Kat has, it was really difficult to choose what exactly to highlight from Kat's experience, but she has worked at the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown in the UK. She's led the process for integrating strategy and foresight for the UK Foreign Office. And Kat is the founder of the School of International Futures. So I'm really fascinated by experience. I'm sure she can share amazing stuff with us, and we'll all be very motivated at the end of the session. What I really liked in our conversations is that she highlighted a personal passion and motivation in social justice, and particularly the importance of multi-stakeholder approach to the challenges that we face today and in the future. Kat, you are very humble, you have an amazing experience, and in our conversations, you said that you don't call yourself a futurist, even though you're impacting the future. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Lovely, I'm very happy to. And hello everyone, it's lovely to be here, and I'm really glad that we've got this kind of setup which will make it much more conversational. So why do I not call myself a futurist? I guess it's because I came to thinking about the future from a strategic planning perspective, from the perspective of working with communities and leaders who have problems today, and thinking about the future can help them solve their problems, but it's very much taken from the point of view of like working for Procter & Gamble. They're thinking about how the price of oil or consumer tastes are changing, or working for the UK government where it's thinking about what does the Arctic thawing mean for geopolitics, or looking at, for example, working with Christian Aid across Africa and the Middle East, where you're thinking about what does it mean for issues of food security and peace building that, for example, a woman in Palestine has 5 children each and a woman in Israel has 1.8 children each. What does that mean to conflict drivers over the next 20 to 30 years? So it was always very much from that perspective that we were looking at things. And having worked in government, what was interesting is that there is no lack of insight about the future. It's not a supply side problem. What it is a demand side issue of using the insights about the future to translate and connect into decision making today. So I think that's the area that we're interested in, and I'm not sure whether that's futurism or what that is, but we need to build a field that really understands what's the burning platform, why people are talking about the future now, what's the vehicle for change, and how do you build coalitions for change amongst incumbents, early adopters, visionaries and entrepreneurs, most of whom can't actually connect or see the world in different ways, but that have a common endeavor around trying to transform their sector or address an issue. So that is, I think, the discipline and the field that I'm really interested in, and that I think a lot of people in this room are as well.
I think the choice of room is particularly good for our topic. What it says there is the ancestors plant the trees. Can somebody read the rest? And obviously the future generations are going to stand under the shades of the trees. I have a particular personal interest in the future of childhood, obviously, because of my profession. You've done a lot of work on just being the voice of multiple generations, and even generations that are not born yet. Could you tell us more about the work that you've done in the field, and particularly about the intergenerational fairness framework that you've developed?
Absolutely, and I thought I'd bring that to life by telling a story of some work that we've been doing in Portugal, who, in the spirit of The Princess Bride, it's a story with characters and heroes and villains, and it's got perhaps a happy ending, but there's a lot of drama and failures on the way. But perhaps, before talking about that story that Portugal has gone through in its exploration of thinking about intergenerational fairness and why that's such an important question in a country where in the 1960s there were 200,000 people born every year, and nowadays there's only 80,000. That causes all sorts of interesting dynamics in a country. But I want to kind of pull back first and say, why is this such an interesting and important topic, having worked on this for the past 6 years? And I think, first of all, the impact that our decisions today are having on future generations is now a question that more and more politicians, leaders, and civil society leaders are thinking about. And it's a question for leadership of like, what does it mean to, after COVID, in the face of planetary boundary challenges, how can we think about how our decisions today impact future generations? Who wins, who loses? And that question of intergenerational solidarity, the fact that we're taking decisions today together to support the future, but also this question around an intergenerational contract is, I think, becoming a real question of leadership nowadays. So you've got Ursula von der Leyen in her speech 2 weeks ago to say this is the agenda for myself and the EU over the next year. Intergenerational solidarity and a contract was at the core of that. You've got the German Constitutional Court saying that it's now a duty upon all German citizens and organizations to make sure you do not limit the future, the freedoms of future German citizens. So this is a big trend. You've got people in COP26 talking about, we need to do something for our children and children's children. So this is a big shift that's happened. People are framing leadership about being a leader and a steward, not just for today, but for tomorrow. The second thing, the interesting question is that, can we move beyond lip service on this point? Yeah? How do you actually operationalize these commitments, and how do you hold people's feet to the fire? And I think that's the work that we've been doing, is looking at what's the role of assessments, dialogues, and institutions to help that happen. And then I think the third reason why I think this whole conversation is really important from the point of view of us as a community of futurists, or whatever the term is that we want to use, is that this is the missing part of the puzzle, yeah? Like, leaders have always known the long-term consequences of their action. The fact is, however, is that there have been insufficient incentives to stop defection to the short term, right? It's not that we don't know what the signals of change are. It's not that we can't see what might happen 1 year, 5 years, 20 years. It's like, what is the balance of pressures to kind of act for the long term now? And I think an intergenerational fairness assessment, which harnesses the power of Generation Z, particularly, and I went, there's an argument to be said that, for those of you who remember, in the global financial crisis in 2008, we were all talking about building back better, right? We were all talking about how there's no official future, but what actually happened? There was a wholesale transfer from the poor to the rich, and the underlying drivers for the kind of inequality that we've got at the moment now happen. So it's not about lip service, it's about action. So it's like, this is the change that we're in at the moment. It's the urgency, it's the fact of the pandemic, it's the mobilization of Generation Zs who basically have nothing, little to lose by not investing in legacy institutions, that I think make this really interesting. So that, I think, is the big opportunity around intergenerational fairness and why it's important to the Foresight and Futures community. But, I mentioned Portugal, and I'm saying, Portugal, the demographics are like that, like a lot of countries. They have serious increasing issues around fire and water, and there is a growing attraction of young people for the right wing, for right-wing politics, people who are like, let's go outside the kind of mainstream democratic system, because there's nothing in it for us. So I guess the question I did want to, perhaps at this point, invite you to turn to the person next to you And I'd be really interested if you could talk to the next person next to you and go, in your own country, what are some of the intergenerational dynamics? So, for example, we've had conversations in Northern Ireland. They're like, intergenerational dynamics means that we're really worried because of Brexit of the peace failing, and that's the intergenerational stresses that we have of young versus old. Poland has got a party for the old people. Romania has got issues around diaspora and different kind of the hollowing out of the youth bulge. So again, let's just spend 3 minutes talking to the person next to you about what are the intergenerational dynamics in your country.
Hi. Well, we can talk about that as well. I let them do so, we will do it together. Yeah, I was gonna say. Well, I'm originally from Bulgaria, even though I live in the UK. But I did a project for Lidl in Bulgaria 2 years ago, and we were looking at the future 10 years ahead. Bulgaria has the same problem as Portugal, except worse, because we don't bring people in. People are dying off. It's an aging population, we're shrinking. So in 10 years' time, we will have 500,000 people less, which is 8% of the population. So who is going to pay the pensions and who is going to work? And there is no strategy for that. So it's just making me really sad, and I've offered my services to the government for free. But we don't even have a stable government. So it's quite a big issue, I think, across the board. Share some thoughts?
Yeah. Ask 3 people.
Yeah, exactly. Totally. Okay, guys. I know it's very interesting to speak to the people next to you. Hi, everyone. Let's come back to the room, please. I'm sure you had a very interesting conversation. We would like to hear from 3 people, just some observations about what you've heard from the person next to you. What shocked you? What was interesting and important in your opinion? Who would like to volunteer? Please go ahead.
Brenton was telling me about Australia, where a group of children took the government to court, claiming that for holding the Minister of the Environment culpable for not exercising the duty of care, and the government won the case by arguing they didn't have a duty of care to the environment or to the younger generations.
Yes, absolutely. Who would like to go next? John, can I volunteer you?
I live around the world, but I decided to just focus on South Africa. We have a massive youth unemployment. And I was part of a panel in Youth Day in South Africa last year. And the older generation want the youth to be trained to get jobs, but there are no jobs. And this forcing of the youth to get the jobs is the real problem. And my suggestion to them was to create heroes out of the guys who had broken out of the poverty cycles from the townships, utilizing the internet, to get them to be the people that we look up to rather than the jobs that are fictitiously out there. And the second thing, to really proliferate the ubiquitous need for Wi-Fi around the country, especially in the townships and the poorer areas. And thirdly, to only teach entrepreneurship online, and to teach them how to access the 5.5 billion people that are out there that could be possible customers. So there's a drive around that right now in the country called YES, which is the president's program around that. But still, there's a lot of pressure and respect in the African tribes for their elders. And so there's a lot to break out from that still.
That's great. And I think we have an example of how youth passion can actually change the course of legislation and the world. And as well as an example of, or kind of, it brings something to mind to me. How do we make sure we solve problems that are going to exist in 10 years' time versus solving from today's perspective? So I love your example as well. Could I have one more person who would like to share?
Did someone focus on, for example, the nature of intergenerational exchanges or concerns about older people represented in politics?
And maybe I would like to hear from a lady as well.
Well, actually, this is well discussed. Greece and the UK. So, yeah, thank you. It was very obvious how policies are now, the policies that we have in both countries, Brexit or the way that the financial policies in Greece are established, is simply because the voters are mostly old people. So we've been discussing how everything would be different if, for example, kids were voting instead of people above 60 years old, how the policies would be different. And Brexit is one example. The policies that we have in Greece for environment or budgeting would be the other case, for example. Yeah.
Thank you. Would you like to share the Portugal example?
Yeah, I'll share the Portugal example. Of course, numbers doesn't necessarily mean capture of the democratic process, as Nigeria shows very well. And actually, some of the intergenerational dynamics are the other way. In Singapore, older people have worked to make the country a huge success, and they're going to benefit from much less life expectancy or access to social services than their grandchildren. So my point is that these are complex issues and these are spaces for exchange and solidarity. But as we have also identified here, if we don't address that, and we've got a short runway to turn what potentially could otherwise be intergenerational conflict. And there's all sorts of different reasons for talking about that, from the fact that in the past, there were 2.5 generations alive at any one time, and now we've got 4 to 5, possibly more. That's going to be interesting. To that whole kind of movement of how to be a good ancestor, to different people who are saying it's actually the representative democracy process that's broken, because that infamous statistic about France, 60-year-olds own 60% of all the assets, and they're 60% of the voting population in terms of over 60-year-olds. So there's all sorts of ways to slice and dice, and I think, that's just looking at our kind of liberal kind of post-enlightenment kind of era, let alone all sorts of extremely valid indigenous ways of thinking that basically tell us that, of course, thinking around 7 generations or 200 years back and forward is really important. So for whatever reason, there is a consolidation of interest in this topic. Now, back to the question, how do you operationalize it, right? Which is the million-dollar question. And the protagonist of my story is a foundation in Portugal called Gulbenkian. And I think that's important because they are a steward who are taking the lead, and they're not political, and they're kind of civil society, and they've got convening power to kind of say, we care about this country, we help this country transition after the end of the dictatorship. We played a critical role, and we see that there are underlying drivers for intergenerational conflict in our society. So what they did was they commissioned work going, is this the case? Let's talk to politicians and citizens to find their views and understand what's going on. And they found that, if you look at housing, pensions, environment, financing, there is absolutely a problem. Now, why is it that people aren't doing anything about it? Politicians were like, yes, we think it's important, and so did citizens. So they were like, what's going on, right? And they found that there's 2 gaps. There is a constituency gap and then there is a data gap. So when decisions are being made at a policy level, or at local or national level, there is, nobody stops to ask the question, what's the impact? There's that question about data in different domains as well. But also, when the decision is being made, nobody is there to pick up the phone and articulate and advocate for future generations. So they're like, what we want is an assessment process that helps close those two gaps. So that we've developed this process, I can talk to you about it, but basically it's been applied in different ways. The Bank of Portugal used it to do an ex-post assessment of the pensions reform in 2007. Who benefited and who lost? Which of the different generations alive now and in the future who are benefiting in net? Then, for example, with new legislation coming out around COVID, the independent audit body, like the equivalent of the GAO or the NAO, were using it to kind of go, okay, let's look at this ex ante and say, is the process through which it's being developed, but also the legislation, is it likely to cause harms to particular generations, and how do you remedy them? So all we're doing, we're trying to shine a light and ask the question to enable remedy. Also, for example, there's an airport that needs to be built. There's communities involved. How do you bring communities together to discuss what are some of the consequences? So if you like, that is the impact that it's had. We can talk about how it's been used in different countries as well and the interest internationally, but I can also talk a little bit about the thinking behind the design, if that's helpful.
Yes, I would love to hear about that, and I would love to, there are a few things that pop out from what you're saying. One of them is how we all work together and who are the stakeholders that take decisions, but please go ahead with the example.
So I think that was the really interesting question. When first of all, a tick box exercise never changed the world, right? It automatically results in gaming and all sorts of problematic activity. A lot of the kind of, whether it's gender, equalities, assessments, don't really result in change. So what is it that actually results in change is the information and how it's used in the institutional context. So you effectively, first of all, need a set of institutions able to use it, and then the incentives for using it. But also, what's interesting is when you're looking at intergenerational fairness assessment, you don't know what the future is going to be like, so you need to stress test the assessment itself against different scenarios of the future, yeah? So that already opens up, like it needs to be a strategic foresight approach where people are understanding the system dynamics of the country, alternative big uncertainties, and possible alternative scenarios, right? So you're already opening that up. That was extremely important. It also needs to be long-term, therefore it needs to be resilient and held in an institutional context so you can hold it over the longer term. But most importantly, who gets to decide what fair is in the future is not the politicians and the civil servants and the academics of today, right? It has to be a space where you actively design in alternative perspectives and recognize that values are going to change, and that therefore, to cut a long story short, one of the key anchors, as well as the institutional anchor, and we've recommended a future generations ombudsman, but there's other aspects to that we can talk about. But the other anchor is a dialogue around an intergenerational dialogue around the future we want 2050, which is designed to have intergenerational exchanges amongst people in the periphery, different communities, but also designed in space to ensure the views of generations unborn are considered. So the whole design has really been kind of drawn upon and influenced by great people, by great work by people in this room like Estonia, Japan, and different countries like that, Wales, etc., Singapore, Finland. So that's been a really important part of actually how, by asking that simple question, you're also introducing an awareness in the policy-making community and amongst decision makers in business and in civil society that this that these questions of uncertainty and voice are actually a critical aspect to being able to answer what at first seems quite a simple, if not question. So that's, yeah.
So I think it's become clear the importance of foresight, of using foresight to actually be able to move the needle when you take decisions today. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. But you had a very good example of, I think it's a very practical example that exemplifies how a solution was found to a stagnating sector. So I would like for you to please share that with the audience.
Yeah, I think that focus on change is really important. I think just on the intergenerational fairness piece, I think this whole, having a dialogue in society that is not held by government, the executive. This is, by the way, a reason why I don't think we should have a Ministry of the Future, which is held by the executive. It needs to be a bipartisan thing, therefore either in Parliament. But I actually think having foundations or leading civil society organizations or networks of businesses, we were talking about this and how this might work in Thailand, who are kind of the stewards and convening those conversations about the future, 2050, etc., is really critical. And just to complete this, in the UK, the way that this is being used is there's an all-party parliamentary group for future generations, and so we've developed an associated assessment where when legislation comes before Parliament, that it is assessed for its long-term consequences, and in 2 weeks you work with citizens, you work with civil society groups and academics, as well as the members of Parliament, to kind of say, these are the ways in which this legislation is good for future generations, and these are the ways in which it's bad. Here are some of the remedies to consider, and here are some of the text changes that you might want to include in the legislative reform process. So it's all about being uber pragmatic and practical about what questions you need to ask and change to create. But in terms of that, you asked about, this is perhaps a wider, as well as work on intergenerational fairness, which is, I think, a critical way of getting leaders to connect into the fact that, understand what is the long-term consequences of some of their decisions today. We've also been working with different sectors who are really interested in change and transformation. So perhaps I should take a step back and share that the work that we do is, for example, we work on the future of organized crime, looking at helping different policy and organizations think about the future of terrorism. We sometimes work, for example, in Mozambique with young people, so when you're rebuilding after a cyclone, you're not rebuilding what was there before, you actually rebuild to a positive future that is held by young people apart from the old used future of government leads. But then, I think, and this is something really interesting about what the unit of analysis is in our field, it's not at the individual or the team level, it's often at the sector level that change happens. And a really good example that we were talking about of that is the nuclear proliferation sector. So the sector who, since 1991, has been really quite stuck because there's been very little attention to it. And, same people talking about the same thing, how do we get rid of nuclear weapons, and just very little innovation or interest happening in that field over 30 years. Now, the interesting story is that about 4 years ago, and we can talk about why, about 4 years ago, they decided that they wanted to bring strategic foresight as a tool and an approach to help them totally reform how they were thinking about what's possible and to reinvigorate and re-engage the wider community about why a nuclear zero world is necessary and possible. So what they've done is they've brought in a lot of strategic foresight techniques to do the kind of 3 horizons thinking of bringing incumbents, entrepreneurs and visionaries to help them develop a process by which they can then reach out to young people, talk about, engage with indigenous communities and borrow from their insights and perspectives, engage with, for example, the health emergency crew or the kind of climate funding, and actually rethink about what this endeavor in this sector really looks like. And, you know, especially when you're talking about nuclear power and nuclear, that intergenerational fairness perspective, given the longer term consequences of isotopes involved, is a very helpful way to put different perspectives back on the table and to rethink. So what's fascinating is that they, as a community, have come together to really open up and think about what it means to create a world for 2045 that is a nuclear bomb-free world. And they've done this just in time as suddenly the issue has really got rocketed up, no pun intended, on the agenda. And I think there's something really powerful about thinking about what does it mean as a futures practitioner to kind of look at a sector that's interested and ripe for reform, and what is the practice and the design and the approach that means that we host and convene those processes to bring different kind of actors together to lead to a process of transformation. And I think the food security sector is very ripe for that as well, the humanitarian space, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and I really love this example because when Kat was starting to tell me the story, obviously I heard nuclear weapons and I shut down. But it's an awesome example of how, you know, you can use foresight to disrupt yourself and to actually bring peace at the end of it. And we were talking about why, and one of the reasons that you mentioned was the cognitive diversity that kind of replaced the sameness in the decision-making process. So I just wanted to highlight that as well as a you know, not only intergenerational thinking and diversity, also gender diversity, background, and so on. I think that's quite an important one. It's been fascinating to hear all of this experience. Obviously, I am focused on the unheard voices, on the future of childhood. And all of us here, we come from different backgrounds, we take different types of decisions. If we were to leave this room today with one thing or several things that are practical that we can all start doing, what would they be? Can the framework and the questions that you use help us? How can we start making positive change? I'm a hopeless utopian futurist, and I really feel like you guys, you know, hold the power to change the future. So I think with practical examples, we can not be hopeless, we can be hopeful.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, please download the Intergenerational Fairness Assessment Framework. It's online, it's Creative Commons. There's a kind of complex set of questions behind it that actually absolutely look into different forms of distribution and equality and representation and identity as part of it, not just intergenerational. But at its heart, there's 5 questions, 5 simple questions that you can ask, that it was designed for 12-year-olds to also ask those questions. Is this policy moving us towards our vision of the future? You know, who's winning and who's losing out of generations alive now at the moment? And that's about the fact that, you know, a lot of environmental urban policies are harming older people, and any kind of effective intergenerational fairness approach needs to recognize that. So it's, you know, absolutely advocating for the interests and rights of all people, not just young. You know, is it adversely affecting vectors that transmit intergenerational fairness or privilege over generations, like housing and assets like that? So there's some nice questions that you can ask. So I would encourage you, download it and use it. Whether you're in a business, it's something that that we are encouraging the C-suite to use, you know, as their role as a steward for future generations. And BrandPie have just done a piece of work showing that, you know, 30% of CEOs at the moment in 2022 think that future generations are critical stakeholders. So this is a way of actually bringing that to the fore, just asking that simple question. So that would be the big takeaway. But also, I think there's something about asking, what's the burning platform and what's your vehicle for change for why you're thinking about the future, because it has to change the world around us in the here and the now.
Yes. One of the other things that we discussed was around, the fact that we need to focus on fixing some of the issues that we have today and for the future here on Earth. Because we've heard a lot today and yesterday about space, about immortality. So just, could you share a couple of words on that, on your thoughts?
I think that we were like chatting, and it's like, oh my God, please let's not expand geographically or over time until we sort our shit out, basically, in the here and the now, was my kind of, I think, what do I think? So like, foresight, I think there's two ways of thinking about our discipline of futures and foresight. One is that it's a crystal ball where we can use it to kind of dominate reality, to kind of, I'm not going to use the colonized word, but to kind of conquer new domains and frontiers and be right about the future and super forecast what's happening and be better than others. So that's one metaphor. And then I think there's another metaphor for the discipline that we're doing, which is that the future is a mirror, and that taps in much more into the kind of William Gibson quote, which is, it's already here, but it's just unevenly distributed. So actually, the endeavor that we're in could be seen instead as not a competitive who's right endeavor, or to shape that future with the new technology, but to actually realize that the answers are already here, and what we really need to do is design processes with humility that enable those different alternative voices to come to the fore and the solutions that people already have. And therefore, the exercise that we're on and field building is about voice and agency, and about recognizing power and always seeking to bring Horizon 2 and Horizon 3 actors in parity to Horizon 1 leaders. And I think, speaking truth to power is absolutely what it's about. So, we also talked about next generation foresight practitioners network that we run, which is like 600 fellows from people from next generation foresight practitioners from 88 different countries, and they're talking about futures methods from around the world, and that's very much the vein in which they're using it, which is that that indigenous knowledge is already there around addressing existential risks. A lot of communities have faced through, slavery, through huge environmental collapse, the kind of existential risks that we now are going, oh, this is a really interesting topic. Now we need to kind of connect back and tap into those kind of sets of knowledge and understanding and spaces and processes and design and methods to enable that to happen, as I think the next generation of what we're trying to do.
Yes, and there's a quote on your website which I absolutely love, so I'll probably paraphrase it a little bit, but it goes something like this: the systems are crumbling, we are excited. So I'm really inspired by the rebelliousness and the fact that, hey, we don't have to build the old normal. Let's let go of that. Let's use foresight. Let's consider all of the different stakeholders and focus on solving the problems of the future.
Absolutely.
And with that in mind, would you like to share like a last message with the audience?
Yeah, well, not using my words, but I think it's Schumacher's quote that is just so powerful, which is that our work is to be midwives to the new, but also hospice carers to the old. And I think that's the, there's a lot of, this is an exciting endeavor, and we need to bring everybody along in that process, in that journey.
That's great. Thank you, Kat. It's been fantastic. I hope it was inspirational for you, and I'm sure that we would love to hear from you if you have any thoughts on the subject. There are questions. We have actually a couple of minutes. Would you like to take a couple of questions?
Thank you, dear. I would like to ask you something. I mean, there is a tribe in Chile, in the Andes mountains, that named the Aymaras. The Aymaras, they have an interesting point of view about the future. When and you can say this in their way of communication. When they talk about future, they do this in the back. When they talk about past, they do this. Different than our, and has a proper comprehension about why they do this. My question for you is, what do you consider that is the role of a culture in the studies of future, because here, for example, we are from different parts of the world. Of course, the approach to get the future will be from different parts, depending on the culture. So what do you think that is the best way to include the culture and all those values when we are talking about, teaching the future? Thank you.
So absolutely right, and many of the fellows that I mentioned earlier are working on a whole series of new futures, tools and methods that connect into the metaphors and mythologies of their different communities. And obviously in India, also the whole kind of time as cyclical, also this kind of future back, or time as kinship, which is another article that's been done, which is a fantastic article, and I recommend from a Native American, Kyle Whitehouse, that I recommend that you read. Absolutely, and what I would encourage you to do is to look at the NGFP community and all the interesting, innovative work that they do, absolutely in that field. It's really critical. Abby, do you have anything to say?
No, nothing to say now, but I can definitely have a chat. Yeah. All good, I'm conscious there are other questions.
Okay.
I'd like to hear from a lady as well. So in terms of questions, could we get one last question over here? Or Rosa? And while we're doing that, could I please ask that you put the QR code on screen?
Yeah, thank you. Hello, I'm Seren Dalkeran from the Netherlands. We clearly live in an extraordinary time where old paradigms are not responding to the new emerging reality. And we are in this between phase where we need new paradigms, new frameworks of understanding, new worldviews. And in my PhD, I looked at whether the next generation of leaders, millennials, could be the carriers of the characteristics of new paradigms. Because as a purpose-driven generation, more than half of the world's population, expected to be 75% of the global workforce in 2025. We're now called pandemials, a generation that's expected to be a lost generation soon in the face of all these challenges. So we clearly need to invest in resilience. And as a purpose-driven generation, it's important that we develop the skill sets to succeed in our need to be purposeful and thrive. And those are the skill sets of the future that machines cannot replace. So alongside heightened technologies and advancement, we need social technologies. We need to preserve the human factor. And my generation has a critical role to play in that. So what would be your take on this? And how do we do this in collaboration with other generations and not discredit what they have done in building upon what they have brought throughout history in unfolding our own pathway and navigating the future? Yeah, thank you.
So absolutely spot on. I think that the need for trust and the intergenerational spaces and exchange is incredibly important. I mean, and for me, this is we've hit 80 years since the Second World War. The ways that we govern are no longer really fit for purpose, and a lot of what you've just identified, I think, has to be the core of what a kind of policy making fit for the 21st century looks like, that has been presaged by Alvin Toffler with anticipatory democracy and been talked about for many, many decades. But I think this is the moment in which we need to actually explore what that looks like. And the thing that makes me optimistic is that there are really interesting examples of that around. We just need to scale it up really quickly, including, of course, from your home country in the Netherlands.
Thank you very much. We're at time, unfortunately. I know you have a lot of other questions, but maybe we can stick around. Before we leave today, could I please ask everyone who hasn't had the chance to scan the QR code and answer these two questions to do that? Rosa, I know you also had a question, and John has one. Apologies.
We can take them later.
Yes, we'll take them later.
Please contact us as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much for
Thanks so
attending.
much for
Thank you,
joining us.
Kat. It's been very inspiring.